Dog shows. How can you spot an underdog? In addition, how can we identify someone who is a runt of society? Although some alpha types might suffer from spinal issues, in addition to the fact that some people end up with a metal rod in their spine, it's no surprise that posture plays a role in identifying leaders and followers in society. Some of the other traits might include eye contact and even mouth breathing, but some of those traits might be a cultural expression or simply that someone has blocked nasal passages. The way people walk, talk, and other body types of language might also play a role. In addition, if someone never admits their weaknesses, always acts confident in every decision, and remains in an attitude where they never reveal any insecurities, those are also traits of an alpha type. Ironically, alphas are typically very insecure, and I have encountered many powerful leaders who have revealed their vulnerable side in private. One of the boons of having been a very invisible person was that there was a perception that an influential person felt safer confiding in me for the simple fact that they believed that even if I did tell others, nobody would believe me. I have worked closely with ministers, media, and entertainment people, and I've heard some staggering things about how they really feel. In addition to having worked backstage in supportive roles throughout my life, I've also dated a lot of powerful men. Many of them were in the closet, so to speak. And their pathology is as fascinating as it is often bizarre. It is very common for men to want to sexualize parts of their life that are lacking in, like a kink or fetish or something. Almost always when I hear an older man insisting that he plays some kind of slave role in bed or outside of the bedroom, he's an overrated man who has too much power considering his real qualifications and contributions. If that wasn't ironic enough, there are also a type of men who want to be dominated as long as the dominator agrees to follow this complicated laundry list of kinky things that actually make the slave the one who's actually calling the shots. I would imagine this is also true for those other than gay men, but that's just what I gather from personal experience. There are exceptions to this where some people, again, in my experience with gay and bisexual men, cope with their power addiction by not only trying to compensate by opposite role play. However, some work out their inner turmoil by exaggerating their power through role play. In addition to all the insecurity and guilt they secretly feel deep inside for having more power than they deserve, and most seem to hide it even from themselves, they are also afraid. Underdogs are scared of all the realities that exist with living their entire life following their leaders and being under others, never tasting the kind of freedom that the alphas possess. But alphas also live in fear, the fear of losing their power, in addition to the fact that there's always a bigger dog somewhere on Earth. On some conscious level, the alpha dog types believe that although they might have attained the sacred office of top dog in their realm, there's always someone richer and more powerful than they are. Even the most powerful man on earth is still bound by some laws and restrictions, and that makes all of them feel insecure and afraid. One of the biggest fears is that an underdog who might be underrated might somehow be recognized and subsequently take their place. This happens a lot in the movies. We cheer the hero in the story while the genuine, quality, sincere, qualified guy not only gets the job that once belonged to the imposter, but he also gets the girl. Although we like to believe that justice happens in real life, this simply isn't real. Fear causes primitive brain functioning, which bypass any hint of conscience that might still exist in an overrated, power-hungry leader, and thus causes the alpha type to do whatever they can get away with to remain in power and protect their reputation. This is where we get a lot of myths about things people believe and say. One of the things is that some people refer to as the imposter syndrome, among other terms. In the context of my perspective, considering ranking and status, this imposter phenomenon takes two forms, whether somebody is a leader or a follower. The leader feels like they are an imposter because they're getting too much money, power, in proportion to what they actually contribute. And in addition, the followers hear the leaders often talk about skewing their perspective, basically as a constant attempt to remain in their positions. These leaders paint a picture, in other words, subtle brainwashing, that is the leaders who are authentic and deserving of the perks of their positions, and the followers are the real imposters who therefore deserve to be subservient. This explains why a lot of qualified people feel like they are imposters, because they are being programmed to feel that way by their leaders, who often are quite the real imposters. This also explains why a lot of recognized and powerful leaders admit that they feel like they're imposters simply because they are. At the same time, a lot of follower types also feel like they're imposters simply because they are programmed to feel that way. Aside from the myths concerning imposters, there is a growing list of misconceptions in modern society that, from this perspective, need to be challenged. Some of these are derived from ancient civilizations that still exist today in many communities. Money talks is one of those myths. No, it doesn't always talk, because if you are ignored, nobody will believe that you have the money, nor will they even look at you to see if you have money. Karma is the biggest myth that has a biblical component called sowing and reaping. Exposing the roots of karmic concepts and their origins are an entire book and course to themselves. But in a nutshell, I challenge anyone to ask these questions. Do all the bad people you know and know of really have bad things happen to them? And do all the good people you know and know of have good things happen to them? This is followed by the leaders eloquently giving some kind of homily concerning the afterlife. The Bible says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." It's Galatians chapter 6, the New Testament, King James Version. And if that doesn't happen, let's just say that good people get good things in the afterlife and vice versa. This also works for Buddhist and Hindu type ideologies as well, considering a lot of religions believe in reincarnation. Alpha myths. Don't worry about what other people think. is something that I am often told. This is true for a lot of folks who get a lot of positive attention. This is simply not true if, for various reasons, an underdog-type person happens to be in a community that thinks that someone is bad for some reason. If you are LGBTQ plus in a homophobic community, for instance, you could lose your career, your family, and everything. Don't worry, they say, another myth that so many followers hear from so many leaders, and that really doesn't apply to everyone. Speaking of LGBTQ plus stuff, I stayed at a place for gay and bi men years ago that was notorious for alienating certain kinds of men based on status and social ranking. While texting one of the members, I was told, "It is what you make it." Their classism was not my fault. I did not create that kind of behavior. It was not what I made of it. In reality, things happened because I was immediately placed at the bottom of their social order and just tried to make some friends. Something I often hear is very troubling in the context of social ranking is this ugly concept of the victim mentality. I simply cannot think of a time when anyone preached at me about this myth of the victim mentality who I didn't consider significantly victimized. These are often things that highly privileged leaders say to their followers to keep those who suffer in a state of blaming themselves. I do agree that the psychology behind the victim mentalities has a place in personal growth, and that we can learn something from ideas like this. What I do not agree with is how terms like this are used to intimidate and invalidate abuse victims in order to deny care and tangible crisis intervention. I have literally been told that I just feel victimized. I repeated that I don't feel victimized. I am being victimized. I refuse to allow anyone in positions of power, whether in social service or otherwise, to minimize any situation that has to do with me or anyone else who might be in a vulnerable position. Misconceptions about alphas. The biggest misconceptions I have encountered while trying to introduce these concepts, especially to alpha-type people, have to do with hyper-focusing on underdog communities as opposed to underdog individuals. In addition, the concept of perceived privilege has also been a major mental roadblock for many. In my experience, trying to talk to alphas feels like talking to leaders and followers who are in a religious cult. Alphas simply don't feel like alphas. Alphas feel like underdogs. There was always a bigger dog. Also, all of their power feels so normal to them. They don't know what it's like to not have it, nor can they relate to people who don't have it because power comes so naturally to them. They sincerely believe that if the underdogs just imitate them, everybody can have the same results. If the people lead, the leaders will shoot them, has sadly been on my motto doing my research into this subject. Leaders think followers can act like them and simply get away with it. When it comes to success, we often blame those who fail as if everybody on their own has the power to succeed if they just follow the same habits and behaviors. Another thing about power is that it strangely feels right. They are likely to think along the lines of, if they have that power, they must deserve it. Just like money, power is a sort of currency, just like a number in the bank. Whether it's honest money or blood money, It all gets mixed together in a bank account. It can be used for good things no matter how it was acquired. Power acquired unfairly feels moral to them. In addition, they not only believe they are entitled to that power, they also feel they have a responsibility to have that power and more of it. There was also the principle of how status and ranking is dependent on a myriad of personal characteristics, including health, personality, appearance, posture, wealth, caste, family, religion, race, gender, orientation, gender expression, social skills, job, education, age, relationship status, social media ranking, mental health, home ownership, vehicles, and possessions, in addition to a much longer list of things like how many friends someone has, or whether or not they had any problems with the law, substance abuse, or perceived substance abuse, and the list goes on and on. Someone's status is not only a lengthy spreadsheet of pluses and minuses, of that and more. It also changes based on your environment. For instance, as a gay man in one environment, I can be seen as included, while another alienated as a result. Aside from taking some type of exhaustive inventory of what gives or takes away your power in the context of your ever-changing environment, I admit that you may still not come up with an accurate assessment. Although I would rather not include any references to someone's zodiac birth chart, I also admit I've seen a lot of things that might indicate some confirmation of alpha or underdog traits. Even birth order can play a significant role in determining someone's role as a leader in society or not, although some families that might not be the case. Whether someone has a laundry list of characteristics that might qualify them as underprivileged or traits that mark them as privileged. Some are just things to consider. I used to focus on my weakness when trying to get help, while those in places of influence were just went through my list and had eloquent theories to explain away all the barriers in my life. If not, the other tactic I noticed was to hyper-focus on the trait that was the least likely to be significant. Whether we can or cannot place an accurate value on someone's personal power or lack of may not be the best place to start. We might as well just look at the end result. How easy is it for someone to successfully get a lot of people to follow them? How easy is it for someone to hold the attention of a lot of people for a long time? After all, from a biological standpoint, alphas literally smell different. There is enough science to convince me that alpha-type people actually have a different chemical composition and types of brain functioning that are unique to influencers. Most of it has to do with a different cocktail of stress hormones, pheromones, and other chemicals that on a subconscious level, they literally smell different. Basically, born leaders have a biological advantage. Their followers are stressed for the same reasons why baboons are stressed and traumatized in proportion to their rank. In addition, leaders are stressed out for a lot of reasons, including all the conflicts that being over people produces. Aside from that, it is likely that so many leaders get appointed simply because of their biology and not their abilities, that they are just not able to do the management jobs they are hired for. That might be an academic and scientific amount of why your boss is constantly telling you to do stupid things. In fact, if you happen to be working on your PhD in psychology, you might encounter a semester dedicated to the subject entitled Why Your Boss is a Douche 101. That also explains why the regional manager hired that site manager, because she or he has what it takes, although no knowledge of that particular industry. When it comes to anyone having some sort of biological advantage, most people would probably assume that we are discussing racial issues. In recent generations, a lot of governments, businesses, and organizations have adopted these fabulous little diversity statements to splat on their human relations paperwork, their websites, and other public relations stuff. I admit, I like those, especially for queers like me. However, if my science is correct, and if these born leader alpha type folks really do have a biological advantage to rule over others, would that belong in a list of other traits like gender, race, and ethnicity, and the like? What would it be called? At the Herman Corp, we do not discriminate based on your role in the metaphorical litter of metaphorical puppies, in addition to whether you are, whatever. Instead of labeling it as social status or even alpha personality traits, although those might someday legally work on a diversity statement, I would hope that there would be a term that could communicate something to the effect of recognizing someone's biological advantage to take charge of others. If someone were more knowledgeable and had better character, they could be considered for a management position, only if everyone around was willing to make up for what they lacked biologically. Otherwise, that new manager might get pecked to death by everyone constantly testing whether they are in the pecking order. Aside from whether we label someone as an alpha dog or an underdog or a runt based on a multitude of personal traits, one thing is for certain: these terms are very fluid. I will teach a large and productive class with students who listen, respect, value, and even admire what I do, and within the hour I might go to a party where everyone assumes I'm some kind of loser and treats me like I am worthless. Then I might be at a festival where nobody knows who I am until I get on stage and perform a concert. Because of my unusual lifestyle, it enables me to be perceived and treated as a powerful leader, and at the next moment the opposite, or vice versa. This can be a similar phenomenon for someone who travels abroad to a prestigious European city, followed by flying to a third world nation and being treated like a god. They can wear the same clothes, act the same way, and be treated like they know and have nothing important to offer, only to be in a different environment that enables them to get just about anything they want. Because of my background in creative careers, I contend with status and ranking constantly. There are times when a gifted artist does get recognized. Over the period of roughly a decade or so, I noticed them losing their ability to create product, and that were as moving, as original as when they were unrecognized. There are also a handful of creative professionals who somehow do maintain their inspiration, and although there are ways they can get around that, I would like to think that some have, whether conscious of it or not, managed to not be addicted to their power or abuse it. I believe there are some influential people in the world today who have somehow been able to place progress as a higher value than power, although based on my observation, those are anomalies. As a result of the abuse and the addiction of power and the social anarchy of ranking and status-based societies, I have observed adults acting like children, sentient beings acting like robots, and humans acting like animals. Even with creative careers, it seems to operate on the principle of survival of the fittest. That principle should be attributed to the animal kingdom, not us. Sentient life, like humanity, should be on earth to create, not to dominate. And now for the science of your douchebag boss. In addition to the myriad of misconceptions, sadly, my list keeps growing, and I would imagine that this list may never be complete. I would love to be in some kind of position where I could tell everyone how I want them to talk, including leaders as well as follower types. Just recently, I was talking to a retail worker who had been loyal to his company for several years, although ironically, they ship in these new managers, often mean and irresponsible, from out of town instead of promoting those with experience and seniority. I was reminded of when I was working in retail when I was younger. In fact, it was quite a skilled position considering my experience working with musical instruments. The owner had hired somebody whom I was supposed to train. When this trainee started ordering me around, I was confused, and I just kept working. I was later scolded, and it was just because it was not clear to me that I was training my new boss. I just assumed I was training another retail worker like myself. Having been asked in recent months why I wasn't promoted, I began to try to prompt some ideas about my findings before I would blurt out my conclusion. This was yet another example of how my society, followers as well as leaders, are so reluctant to my research on this matter. I asked this man if it were possible that there could be a biological advantage to leadership. He responded that he believed it was sociological and thus something that could be altered via changing social behaviors. I even suggested that I might have studying on various subjects for several years to come to an alternate conclusion to why unfair things like this happen, and I was followed by a sheepish expression. A few days after that little discussion, I took a drive through the woods past an open range. I slowed down because there was a herd of sheep trying to cross the road. As I proceeded, the sheep, nearly touching my front bumper, got out of the way while more sheep kept trying to cross in front of me. It was a sad reminder that sheepish behavior, in this context, means that following the herd is more important than avoiding obvious risks, and perhaps logic and reason itself. In the context of introducing new ideas, whether valuable or not, sheepish human behavior means that following the herd is more important than being open to new ideas, even if those ideas might be based on logic and reason. It occurred to me that aside from various alpha traits that I often refer to, when it comes to hiring management positions, one of those characteristics is a lovely little monster I like to refer to as emotional intelligence. Although contrary to common definitions of this beloved term, emotional intelligence in the context of hiring an experienced boss, and other examples I have observed, can simply be seen as this: the ability to perform under pressure. Perhaps an admirable trait. It might simply be a natural byproduct of being an alpha. Robert Sapolsky's work with baboons, as well as his studies on human behavior, tends to cite that emotions and their regulation are heavily influenced by biological and environmental factors, thus not behaviors that can be imitated to get the same results. Therefore, when hiring management, companies will likely value someone's emotional intelligence, often called EQ, more than their knowledge of the industry, falling more into the category of someone's IQ. Just because alphas have the natural ability to handle stress better means that putting stupid people in high positions can actually be a priority. I just did it. I explained the science of your douchebag boss. High-ranking baboons produce less stress hormones and other chemicals. People are the same way. They even smell different on an unconscious level. As a result, they develop a dazzling resume and a reputation for being the sacred, emotional, intelligent saint of the senior staff. Meanwhile, the low-paying staff with no authority are often having to take the responsibility to make up for all the ignorant decisions that the generals and majors are constantly making, and in some instances, the lower-ranking staff are expected to educate the higher-ranking on how to do their job, which is yet another recipe for disaster. It would be funny if groups of people, whether organized or not, would, in addition to putting qualified people in leadership as opposed to just simply promoting alphas, they would compensate for the lack of alpha traits, including emotional intelligence. For instance, an underdog who knows their job is reacting under pressure when others uplift and support as opposed to pulling them down. Basically, if a non-born leader is promoted to management who is buckling under a lot of stress instead of scolding, there would be compassionate measures taken to make up for what might be lacking. Heck, there are a lot of measures taken to compensate for the stupid bosses already. It wouldn't be too much more difficult to compensate for a smart boss who appears weak. In other words, there are more examples of what Everett refers to as a sick society, and the sum of the equation is the following. It's the weak versus the strong. It's not necessarily the intelligent, the talented, the gifted, the pious, the meek, the compassionate, the experienced, and other positive traits that are placed and remain in power, or that rise to power, rather. It's the strong. Perhaps not just high physical functioning, but also cognitively and social functioning. In addition to this kind of strength, it's also the higher functioning, and sadly what I simply refer to as the bullies who end up in power or places of influence, like arts, entertainment, and media. Living arrangements, or derangements rather, and other territories. I spent most of my life renting rooms and apartments. I've had big rooms, little rooms, big apartments, efficiency apartments, and deficiency apartments. The last few places I stayed at, the landlords would enter without my permission, including a commercial rental in addition to my living arrangements while I was away. When I would complain to others, I was hoping to get some help and support. It's obvious to me that these owners were breaking the law. When seeking help, all I remember hearing were things like, "They're not supposed to do that," or "They shouldn't do that," Well, yes, we all know that. The problem is that the landlords were powerful. I was powerless. They got away with it, and there was nothing I could do but leave. It felt like adding insult to injury when others refused to advocate for me, in addition to stating the obvious, which is a good way to belittle someone. I had even tried security measures, but to no avail. When I was living in an RV, things only got worse. Owners would get suspicious or just need someone to power trip with, and I just could no longer allow that kind of abuse in my life anymore. I'd reached a time in my life where I was simply allergic to the abuse of power. This led to numerous calls to law enforcement against me, verbal abuse, threats, and a lot of loss on my behalf, in addition to more trauma. If I totally gave in to their abusive demands, it would result in depression, enabling others and setting a precedent for them to further take advantage of me. Owning a home again, also, and my first installment of property, has been empowering, and at the same time, it is still prone to conflict, just in different forms. I recently wondered why so many people close to me not only wanted so desperately to tamper with my life, they also got away with it. I must say that things would have been worse in some ways if I didn't do whatever I could to defend myself. However, I've had some tough choices to make about how I'm to respond to these territorial displays. Things got worse either way. I don't fight like animals. I just want them to mind their own business, but they hit below the belt and know what they can get away with and find ways to trap me in their games. If I would give in to their territorial gestures, I'm just enabling further violations and other things that would undermine my personal well-being. If I fight back, that's also what they want, because they know they will win based on the power they possess. For instance, if they were the same kinds of people who are, quote, in bed, end quote, with law enforcement. So calling the authorities does nothing in addition to sometimes putting me further at risk. Bark more, piss less, bite less. One of the main points of this project that I cited earlier was the reference Benjamin Franklin made about people acting like wolves. This also got me thinking about another writing project that I would like to cover concerning whether humanity has been tampered with, or we tampered with ourselves somehow in our own natural process of evolution. In other words, are we still too much, biologically and in other ways, like animals? However, we have things like bombs. If you give bombs to a pack of wolves, they're likely to blow up everyone, including themselves. Fear is a trait of animals. Jealousy is a trait of children. Sleepwalking is a trait of robots. Consuming and devouring a weaker form of life are traits of parasites. Abandoning the weak to defend for itself and probably die alone are traits of reptiles. Is this something tampering with humanity? Perhaps some type of psychic influence from the far corners of the multiverse? If you believe that sort of thing, but one thing, we do know. Ancient writings that date back to emperor worship and other non-human behaviors like slavery. If I take an objective view, watching a biblical epic reenactment portraying slaves while comparing to traveling through the modern-day American Deep South, I see the same basic overall output, whether someone is legally owned or free. I would imagine that way before the dawn of written history, immortalizing mortal humans was quite common, even before tyrannical leaders of giant empires demanded submission, worship, and blind devotion from their followers. Although on occasion, we still attribute godlike terms to people. Even humorously, our evolved civilization does have our idols, or more specifically, American Idol. The problem with gods is that when someone is branded a non-god by society, seeking recognition for their contributions is easily seen as blasphemy. And the punishment is cruel. That's why trying to get a high-profile gig for some performers is considered fatally immoral to those who have already chosen their leaders, teachers, and entertainers. Devotees and those who have a cult following to their favorite artists are not easily converted to serve other gods. I have found that in addition to pleasing a crowd of listeners at some kind of festival can have repercussions with all of the religion of the attention economy. Something as simple as just upgrading my living situation or expanding my circle of friends can have similar consequences within a status-obsessed society. It's not just about buying properties or even cheap properties in my case. It's about taking any territory that makes power-hungry, overrated people feel threatened. My entertainment and teaching careers are the same examples. However, creative careers have more to do with intellectual property than buying land or things like that. Most importantly, besides acquiring assets, what matters way more these days has to do more with the attention economy. The fact that I get positive attention from others makes a lot of leaders feel threatened because they feel entitled to do whatever they consider their property. They own their fans, for instance. Over a decade ago, when I started my own band, Dialectic Flowers, I was astonished by how many other local musicians and gatekeepers behaved regarding venues of up to 50 people. We would agree that public figures who fill a stadium of thousands of screaming fans would freak out if someone else came along and started drawing attention away from them. But 50 people? Yes. Locally recognized entertainers will do whatever they believe they can get away with, no matter how cruel, just to fill a dark and noisy nightclub with a trendy town with a handful of people who are not hardly covering the gas money for their crappy excuse for a band to drive to that part of town. That's how desperate they were to get that tiny piece of the pie. It's not about money, it's about power. Some of these territorial efforts to interfere with my business, my life, my land actually cost my opponents a lot of money. And while I sometimes have to pay little to nothing to defend myself, it's them, quote, pissing, end quote, their finances in a desperate attempt to flaunt their funds like a peacock flaunts his feathers. He has them, while she doesn't, so you might as well show them off. Territorial displays, in addition to trying to steal and overpower me, are also testing me to see whether I'm giving in to them and how much I might be giving in. It turns out that I no longer fully give in, but I also don't fight in ways that is abusive and cruel. I try to keep the peace as much as possible while protecting my interests, and at the same time, I will put it simply, I am not going to lose my humanity, but I am not going to lose my power. When faced with a territorial display that I cannot get out of, I have to make some tough choices. As most self-righteous Libras are, we get out of balance for our obsessions with things like justice, and ironically out of balance with being obsessed with balance. However, in this case, I believe it is important that I do not step too far into being a pacifist or being aggressive in these matters. If I can, I prefer to just walk away from these territorial disputes. However, if I am somehow stuck, I have to seek balance to find the best choices that consider everyone's well-being. Instead of testing me to see what kind of person I am, I wish that these dear territorial folks around me would just ask me. But that's not the point. Children often test their parents to see what they can get away with. The older I get, I hate to wonder if there's such a thing as a fully human person. I also wonder, even more so, if there's such a thing as an adult, a person who is essentially grown up. Not necessarily perfect, just someone who's a total grown up. I do not consider myself fully an adult. If you knew the combination of traits such as my emotional dependency in addition to my relationship with large plush toys, you would agree. I have no shame for never being allowed to develop normally enough to function. I was trying to survive growing up. I had no time to grow up. I had to develop many of these things on my own, and some of them I may not ever have the privilege of developing. So I just cope the best I can.